What you're watching, for those of you who are familiar with Westerns, is a film by John Ford, noted director, who, as part of his World War II service, produced a film for the US government called Manuel Quezon in Memoriam. This is August 1st, 1944. That was Massachusetts Avenue, the Philippine government's headquarters there. And what you are seeing now are the flags of the Allied nations in the capital of the United States in Washington being lowered to half-mast upon the announcement that Manuel Quezon had died earlier that morning. This was perhaps a scene that no Filipino of his generation would have ever have dared to imagine possible. That the death of a Philippine leader would be met with the homage of independent and powerful countries throughout the world, not least because the Philippines was still at the threshold of independence, but not quite there. This is a story that was filmed in Washington, a place that Quezon himself had been very familiar with since 1909, when he had first moved there from the Philippines to become the Philippine Resident Commissioner to the US Congress, a very strange position where you could speak in the US Congress but not vote because you were representing a colonized people. He learned how Americans thought and how, more importantly, I think their leaders acted and interacted, and leveraged this for the rest of his career for the purpose of what had brought him to Washington and would bring him back to Washington over and over again. The question of whether Philippine independence would be achievable within the lifetime of those who had fought for it, established a government that represented it, and then fought for it again as that government was systematically defeated and destroyed by the United States. Quezon spent 2 decades going to Washington to lobby for our independence until it was finally promised in 1934. And he returned there in 1942, this time as the head of a government in exile, a fairly not unusual circumstance during the war. And it's there that the last years of his life played out. Um, in fact, if you go to Washington today, there's still physical, tangible signs of his having been there at the close of his life. If you go to the Shoreham Hotel, where he took up residence, there's one single room where the balcony is enclosed, and that's the suite where he lived because coming from the Philippines, he could not stand the cold, and therefore the balcony was sealed in to present a more tropical condition for him and his family. And you can see that place up to the present. But one thing that was absent in this drama that played out on August 1st in 1944 in Washington was Quezon himself, because his death didn't take place in Washington, although all the rituals that formally announced it did. Um, Looking at his death certificate, which I noticed my father had filled out, um, um, it mentions a tiny little town in the Adirondack Mountains called Saranac Lake. And this is where our story takes us today. Um, you're here because the kind people of Saranac have decided that the 80th anniversary of Quezon's death is worth commemorating. It is a particular milestone, as the D-Day events reminded you just a few days ago. The 80th anniversary is the last time when living participants are expected to be able to participate. We are in a moment of transition, and we have been for some time, where those who have memories of Quezon in his era are leaving the scene. Um, it's a time when to talk about this event, you'd have to have resource people like Luis and myself who weren't even alive when he was alive, much less when he died, but who are already at that point in our lives where we feel compelled to pass on the stories, views, and understanding from our period when we had encountered those for whom this era was very vivid. Um, for me, of course, it was the stories from my father, who you saw as the gangly teenager in that color clip. To my mind, the only color film of Quezon that survives. And it is mainly from him, that the stories I'm telling you were based. But as we'll see, they were amplified. So today I'm going to talk to you about Manuel Quezon, about Saranac Lake, about things that were happening there, around there, on the way there, and so forth. But from three different perspectives. From the perspective of Quezon himself, who was a person in many ways condemned to seeking a place where he could find treatment for a hopeless condition. From the point of view of our family, for whom this is not just a historical event, but a profoundly traumatic family event, and for one that is part of the history of a country, its people, its government, and way of life. Where do I start? I will start our story very late in the game on November 30th, 1941. Back then in the Philippines, this was not only the anniversary of the birth of Andres Bonifacio, the father of the Philippine Revolution, but also National Heroes Day. And it led to a scene that would become, in retrospect, very important. There were Philippine cadets marching in the parade. It started to rain. The cadets broke formation and ran for cover. And a furious Quezon got up, tore up his speech, and bellowed at the young cadets to resume their discipline and come back to the parade. And he used that speech to issue a warning to the Filipinos. He said, any day now, bombs could start falling. War could come, and we are unprepared of this for many reasons, not least those who are opposed to this. The students laughed. And for those who were alive at the time, this was really quite an act of what you would consider lèse-majesté. The students daring to laugh. And again, he had to assert his will and basically glare them into silence. But in retrospect, this was on November 15th, 1941. 15 days earlier, Quezon had reached the pinnacle of his political career by being elected to a second term as president. A month after that, on December 30th, 1941, he was scheduled to take his oath for the second time as president. But within 8 days of this speech, bombs would start falling in Manila, and the same cadets who were laughing at him would find themselves on the road to Bataan and Corregidor. This is a story of people being confronted by events that were unfolding in slow motion. This is a clip from a month before that in October 1941, where Douglas MacArthur had been recalled to active service in the service of the United States to lead the United States Army Forces in the Far East, or USAFE, after having been for quite a few years the military advisor of President Quezon and field marshal of a Philippine army that was still being put together. Their relationship had become very strained up to this point. At a certain point, Quezon had lost faith in the idea that the Philippines could defend itself and had actually expressed the hope that maybe MacArthur would put everyone out of their misery and return to the United States. MacArthur stubbornly stayed on, and by October, the two found themselves joining forces again, preparing the Philippines for the war that would come in December of that year. This isn't the place for the MacArthur story, but it is one that leads us to the struggle in Bataan and Corregidor, where the Philippine forces and the American forces retreated and held out until April 1942, only to surrender, and for Quezon to then proceed by PT boat, by submarine, by bomber, by surface vessel, all the way to the United States, upon the invitation of Franklin D. Roosevelt, to establish a government in exile. For that government, um, what was Quezon's role? What was his mission? His mission was to make sure that what had been promised before the war would be fulfilled after it, which was that the Philippines would become independent. Furthermore, that it would become independent and be restituted for its losses during the war. That it would be a country that, having proved its willingness to fight for its own freedom, would have that freedom protected and guaranteed by the very powers that had brought World War II to the shores of the Philippines. This clip is, in many ways, the culmination of his public life because it's an event in June 14th, 1942, in the White House when Mexico and the Philippines signed on to the Atlantic Charter and joined what were then called the United Nations, or the Western Allies fighting Germany, Italy, and Japan. Note that the Philippines was not yet fully independent, but was given the recognition of an independent nation precisely because of its valor uh, months earlier at Bataan and Corregidor. That the Philippines, part of the community of nations that had once been colonies of Spain, just like Mexico, were now taking their place in the ranks of countries fighting against fascism. The rest of Quezon's stay in Washington from 1942 to 1944 would be um, the story of this objective of trying to ensure that the Philippines was given its due, that despite the Europe First policy of the United States, that the Philippines would not be forgotten, that its independence would be redeemed, and most of all, that that independence would be given the means to exist. It was one that was filled with the tedium and the drama that happens only in the small, squabbling, sometimes squalid groups of exile communities that were so common around the world during that time, where a few people clinging on to the outward trappings of power are waiting for the moment when they can come home and resume that power and in a sense, reach a period of reckoning that they dreaded. How would the people feel about their having fled? What would be left to rebuild? What kind of independence could be put together? For us in our family, Saranac was a place sort of mentioned from time to time, um, every August 1st, the anniversary of my grandfather's passing, but always sort of as a perhaps as a place people may not want to remember. In looking at our family pictures, for example, I could only find maybe five or six. One of this lake, which brings up stories of my aunt, my dad's sister, stories of rowing there in the morning, which reminds you of you know, the beautiful isolation of the place. Shadowy pictures of a house that had the grand name of Camp McMartin, but was really sort of a ramshackle group of homes um, with a flagpole that just sort of reminds you that this was an official residence, but a place that I think was more uh, mentioned as a traumatic end than as of a destination that actually may have lingered fondly. I never got that impression. Um, and a snapshot of a chapel that looks like it's full of flowers. And up to now, I speculate, was this a snapshot of the night that the Quezon's body lay in state, waiting to return to Washington or not? Um, it tells you that much as this place has been so vivid in our imagination, it has been a sort of ghostly presence, one mentioned in passing, but always in the context of loss. About 15 years ago, this clip was brought to my attention. It's from the same film of John Ford, and it's of Saranac Lake. It's of this home. It's of this place. It's a moment frozen in time. The stuff on Quezon's desk in that room. The chapel, because it was suitable for the stay of a Catholic family because the owner's brother was a bishop and therefore needed a place to say mass. Um, about as Filipino friendly, therefore, a place you could find in the middle of nowhere. Um, but again, by the time I saw this, most of the people I had met who had actually been there were already gone. So um, I viewed this film with a sense of discovery and yet of loss, of suddenly, you have sepia colored impressions, suddenly getting this technicolor um, view, and yet not being able to share it with the people who actually were there. But here it is. Um, the home, the outside, the flagpole with the flag, the porch, which later on will have some significance. The place where my dad's sister would row in the morning, and the views that she must have known. My dad liked sleeping late, so he never saw this view. For example, the room um, where my grandfather stayed, and most perhaps poignantly of all for us, the bed in which he died. And over it, you will see a metal crucifix. And um, that metal crucifix I actually held in my hands because my aunt still had that crucifix. It had originally been buried with my grandfather. And I found that picture that was half eaten. It did have an effect. Because of that, I know for a fact something that no one else knew until we started fussing over family pictures. This is perhaps the last photograph of Manuel Quezon taken in life. And we know it was taken in Saranac Lake, and we know that is the bed in which he died because you can clearly identify the bedboard behind him. What this picture would not tell you, and only the video could have told you, was it turns out it was green. But this is how the past collides with the present and always asks us to revisit it and review it. Just at the time of the pandemic, 2019, a Filipino named Ivan Henares contacted me out of the blue on Facebook, where every Filipino now lives, and said, "Do you know, I've just been to Saranac Lake." And I said, "What were you doing there?" He goes, "Well, I just happened to be curious about the place, and I went and I took pictures and I talked to people, and here are the pictures." And all of a sudden, what had been a color film from 1944 suddenly became digital images from 2019. The same deck, the same view of the lake, something I'd never seen, the living room of the house unchanged practically um, in 70 at that point 75 years. The bedroom, um, very same room, not the same bed, but the very same room, clearly identifiable from the films. And other details, the walk-in refrigerator where the gruesome task of embalming his body took place. So that the task was to make him viewable by the time his body would be returned to Manila, perhaps years in the future. The chapel where he lay in state for the last time before returning to Washington for the last time. And even interesting detail, a trunk, a steamer trunk that apparently was still there, had been left behind, and led to intense speculation among myself and my cousins about what's in that trunk. We better retrieve it in case there's something of interest. Well, to add to the drama of this story, now the trunk is missing. And so, for those of you who are into fiction like Luis, you could write pretty good short story about this trunk, I feel, and have a good tale about that. But the closest I have ever come to Saranac Lake is a picture that a reader sent me. Just earlier this year saying, "Do you know what I have on my in my bar? It's a case now empty of Saranac Lake beer, and I want you to have it." And this gentleman who's been hanging on to these bottles of beer for 20 years shipped them to me, and I have them now at home. And so I can say I've touched something from Saranac Lake but not drunk anything. And so there's still we're still waiting for the time when we can actually have a cold one over there. But it shows you that the past keeps coming back. It keeps touching people in ever expanding circles um, of influence. This is a story of a man who in 1922 found himself going to Monrovia, California, to the Pottinger's sanitarium because he had come down with a disease that, in retrospect, he probably picked up when his own mother, who died in his arms, had contracted the disease, and that was tuberculosis. For Quezon's generation, it was a death sentence. It was absolutely surefire that you would die of it. The only question was, how long would it take? Um, I remember watching in the 1980s the film Gandhi, which many of you may have watched. And when the portion of the film brought up the figure of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who is considered the father of Pakistan, my father pulled me and said, "You know, he was like your grandfather. He had tuberculosis. And like your grandfather, he was driven by the mission of achieving independence within his lifetime, come what may, because he knew his days were numbered." Um, Tuberculosis is something still with us. It is still a disease that claims many lives. It has lost perhaps the hopelessness it had in his era, but it is still a disease of poverty. Um, it is a disease which, like any fatal disease, has a profound effect on those who suffer from it. And here, the political, I think, consequence was to make the mission of achieving independence, um, his critics would argue on his own terms, all the more vital and all the more necessary. So, how did Quezon, of all people, end up in Saranac Lake? Um, we are in Washington, it's 1942. Quezon has discovered that after the initial propaganda blitz of welcoming the Philippines into the Council of Nations, it was still a waiting game. He was made a member of something called the Pacific War Council, and every time the people who really called the shots, like Winston Churchill, showed up, it became very clear to him and others, such as um, TV Sung, the Chinese foreign minister, beside him, that our part of the world was going to have to wait. And that the problem of the United States as a democracy was that public opinion would have a large part to play in how that would unfold. And so Quezon found himself having to work to ensure that the Philippines, as I mentioned, was not forgotten, but also to maintain his hold on power as uh, questions of who would rule the government uh, played out, how the Filipinos back home would be handled in terms of the factional fighting among those who were collaborating with the Japanese and those who were fighting the Japanese were concerned. In many cases, all of them Quezon's people, and so forth. And it took its toll on his health. His health had already been very weakened by everything that had been coming together before the outbreak of the war. As I mentioned, he had run for office for a second time, and all of those strains had led to a relapse of his tuberculosis. And a condition made even worse by their stay in Corregidor, the fortress island, in which the Philippine government withdrew until it went into exile. So by June of 1942, he was writing to Harold Ickes, the American official with responsibility over the Philippines, telling him that he had to seek a place to recover because of the return of his tuberculosis. It turns out that it was a good friend of his, a former Governor General of the Philippines, a man whom Quezon had invited to once again be an advisor for the Philippine government, a former congressman from New York. Um, we owe it to Francis Burton Harrison, his friend, who said, "Have you heard of this little town called Saranac Lake? Because it's a place famous for a certain Dr. Trudeau, who happens to be one of the world experts in this disease, and even Quezon's doctors, who included a Swiss doctor who was one of the experts on the disease, said, 'Oh, we never knew that. Of course we should go.' And that's what brought him to Saranac Lake in 1943. And this tells us of the stories that maybe just a couple that I can share with you of the role Saranac Lake played in the goings on in the Philippine government in exile and the people in it. This is my grandfather. That's my father. Down there, my two aunts and my grandmother, together with their physicians and aides, in Leesburg, Virginia, 1942. And all of these people will affect the stories I'm about to tell you now. Um, Quezon was in Saranac Lake, where there were perhaps two important um, questions that were resolved. Um, of course, under circumstances that Quezon was sort of notorious for, where everyone he always used to say, "I have a creative urge when it comes to buildings," which meant he never left any building in which he stayed untouched. So as you saw in Washington, there's that enclosed balcony in the showroom. In Camp McMartin, he had play he had the porch enclosed because it was too cold and needed to be kept warm during the day. So I'm challenging those of you who in historic Saranac Lake, check out the place. I'm sure you're going to find a veranda there that is still enclosed to this day. And you'll know that's Quezon's House Beautiful campaign to keep it under tropical conditions. Anyway, um, he was staying there and getting, they rolled out the red carpet. Here's a letter from the Saranac Lake mayor saying, we're happy to have you, and we'll do anything we can for you. But it was a particular event that happened in late August and early September 1943 that occurs to us. The question was. The Philippines was now under Japanese control. The Philippines had been promised independence in 1946. The Japanese raised the ante and said, "We will give you independence now." And there was great concern both among Americans and Filipinos that what if this changed the whole complexity of Philippine public opinion? And Quezon felt that it was very important that something should be done to reassure Filipinos who had already felt abandoned and in many ways betrayed by the American decision to put Europe first, that their sacrifices and sticking to the Allied cause would be worth it. Henry Stimson, another American figure who had been a Philippine governor general and who was Secretary of War in the government of Franklin D. Roosevelt, went to Saranac Lake um, on his way to Quebec. Quebec, there would be a conference between Churchill and Roosevelt over the policies governing the future direction of the war. And of course, everyone was jockeying to influence those decisions. Henry Stimson was on his way to that conference to lend support to President Roosevelt, but stopped at Saranac Lake in order to have a conference with Quezon about bringing up a question with Roosevelt and Churchill about whether the United States would be willing to make a guarantee of Philippine independence by 1946, regardless of how the war turned out. Um, and more importantly, perhaps, would be willing to give a security guarantee to the Philippines um, to reassure it that if there would be another war, that the United States, even under independence, would guarantee Philippine independence. And so this was an important conference that happened in Saranac Lake between the two leaders. There's a full report in the official history of the State Department, which you can read, and how it bore fruit in two acts of the United States Congress in later years. After that, Quezon became involved in the last fight of his political career, which was over whether he would remain president of the Philippines after his term expired in 1943. Um, in the end, it's a struggle that he won, but at a great cost to his health. And so by December of that year, he once again moved from Washington to Miami, Florida, to be closer to a climate similar to home, at a time when his health had really basically collapsed, and there was increased despondency whether he would be able to bounce back from his tuberculosis as he had so often um, in the past. It was here in Miami that he celebrated his 25th wedding anniversary with his wife, but it is one where his condition continued to deteriorate. And so after Miami, he was brought to Asheville, North Carolina, in um, um, close to the beginning of July 1944. But there, his condition became even worse. And therefore, it was felt that the only solution would be to bring him back to Saranac Lake, because that was really where the best treatment could be had. Harrison, who kept a diary of this whole era, and to which we owe many of the only details we have of it, says that those who saw Quezon being put on the train in a stretcher, being brought to Asheville, said that he was exceedingly feeble by this point. Back in Saranac Lake, we have perhaps the last scene from his presidency of note. We owe it to a Filipino of Scottish ancestry named Joseph McMicking, who was with the command of Douglas MacArthur in Australia, who was sent to Washington to coordinate with the Philippine government to prepare for the return of MacArthur to the Philippines, which was scheduled for October of 1944. This required a tremendous amount of preparation, not least because Quezon and MacArthur had agreed that as much as possible, the authority of the Philippine government would be returned to it upon the return of American forces, instead of having the U.S. Army running the Philippines, as quite a lot of Americans actually wanted to be the case. McMicking brought documents there to be ironed out and fixed, and this is still a chapter that is very little studied, and I think still needs to be written about what exactly was agreed upon, what were the orders and instructions that were arrived at, because of course, as we will see, they immediately became obsolete almost upon the return of McMicking. But this was the other sort of great going on in Saranac Lake, where essentially the finishing touches for what would be the liberation of the Philippines from the Filipino point of view were put together. We know that this was a time when his condition meant that the unthinkable had to be considered. Again, from Harrison, we know that 2 days before his death, Quezon did give his faithful aide, Colonel Manuel Nieto, instructions about how to handle his family affairs in case he died, and that he did have a long and satisfactory talk with his wife. My father told me that his mother actually had a mild stroke after this conversation because the substance of it was that he said he had despaired of being able to come home, and that therefore there were um, decisions that had to be made, including, for example, his instructions to her saying, um, the moment I die, you lose um, control over me because my body will belong to the government and you will have to accept what the government decides to do. Things like that, which are perhaps the intimate side of public life. We have a remarkable document, which again, my aunt, my dad's sister, gave to me about 2005. As our elders do, I think there comes a point in the life of many of those who are seniors where they decide the time has come not to leave things to chance and to systematically start bequeathing family mementos to those for whom it might mean something. And what she chose to give me was a little notebook about this big, uh, which contained the clinical notes of Quezon's doctors and nurses for the last few weeks of his life. It's a interesting, in many ways, very sad document. It outlines to you a course of treatment that I don't think anyone living today has ever had to go through. It tells you the life of a tuberculosis patient is in many ways a waiting game full of tedium, um, full of medicines that are mainly palliative and not really going to do anything. And because it requires a lot of people keeping vigil, it's really a battle of small irritations and little dramas. Um, but it's all we have. And from here we know the last meals he had, the last temperatures he had, the last bodily functions that he had, particularly on the last 48 hours of his life. From one of the doctors, and in fact the one who I'm convinced wrote the final entry in this book, we have the story of his passing, that he had been listening to the news, that he had heard of MacArthur landing in yet another island closer to the Philippines, and that among his last words was just 600 miles. Um, his choice of having one of his doctors read the Beatitudes from the Bible to him, and then all of a sudden the rush and the tumult because um, the final moment had come with an eruption of blood and the inability of his doctors to do anything about it. Um, History is really about the sources we have, the accounts people leave, and the ways they don't match. You have that account by his doctor, very detailed, and another by another doctor who happened to be the head of the Philippine Army, and they don't even agree on the times. Here, General Valdez says that he was called to rush to Camp McMartin because the president was dying, that the president died at 8:20, but his other doctor says that it happened at 10:20. These are the things that happen when you're exhausted, you're writing a diary at the end of the day, and someone is writing an account years later. Um, but in the end, it was a sudden, violent end, and the sudden end of an era. For my father, it was one that had a strange effect of it on him, which was that for all my life, the one thing I could not do was wake him up suddenly. If you wanted him to be very angry, it would be jolt him awake because one day, as he explained to me, I have always associated being jolted awake with the moment my father died, because that was how it happened. He was sleeping. His mother burst into the room, told him, "Your father is very ill." They rushed into the room. They watched their father, covered in blood, die. And then my father did as I think all of us are confronted and must do at that final moment of farewell with what gesture do you do? His was one that there's actually a picture of what it would have been like. His father used to chuck him on the chin, and this is what he did to his father to say farewell. And that last moment. Um, there's the question of all the preparations that must be made for a state funeral and the slow return to Washington, keeping the remains, which had to be embalmed, in that chapel overnight, dressed in formal wear, and then the journey to Washington. Um, this is a film of Quezon State Funeral in Arlington. Um, he's probably unique in any country in having had three state funerals, one given by the United States in 1944, one by the Philippines in 1946, and the third again by the Philippines in 1979. Um, it ends with a story that I think is unique. His body was borne into Arlington Cemetery because his body would be temporarily buried there until it could be returned to the Philippines. And they chose to inter his body in a monument that you could still visit in Arlington. And it's one that you will shortly see in this clip. Um, it's called the Main Memorial. Um, it's a sort of eerie place for someone of his personal life story because it's of course a monument to the USS Maine, which blew up in Havana Harbor, which brought the United States into the Spanish-American War, which led to the United States conquering the Philippines, which was the entire reason Quezon had to mount an independence campaign from the United States after having fought the United States as a major in the Philippine Army of a republic that was destroyed. But that trivia aside, the main memorial also served a different function, and it is why Quezon was laid to rest there, which was it was the temporary resting place for the remains of foreign heads of state who had died in exile in the United States, whose bodies would be returned to their home countries later on. Many years later, in the 1980s, in 1983 to be exact, my father took me there and we walked around and he told me to look inside and I saw something that looked like a big box covered in plastic. And he said, "That is the coffin of the president of Poland." And he said, I have a funny story to tell you about that president of Poland and his being buried in the main memorial. And it's in this article, and I have it there. The president of Poland's name was Paderewski, Ignaz Paderewski. He was a famous concert pianist. Sometime in the 1930s, crossing the Atlantic on the Ile-de-France, both presidents happened to be on the same ship. And the story goes that there was a captain's night dinner, and the two leaders were honored. And so the ship's orchestra, of course, was tasked to play the national anthem. And the ship's orchestra played the Polish national anthem, and everything was fine. But then no one knew the Philippine national anthem. So Quezon had to go up front and, with one finger on the piano, tapped out the Philippine national anthem and taught the orchestra how to play it in front of one of the greatest concert pianists in the world. A decade or so later, both having died as heads of their governments, both ended up being interred in the same place. Quezon's body would be brought back to the Philippines in 1946, but it wasn't until the fall of communism in the 1990s that Paderewski's remains were finally taken from the main memorial and brought back to Warsaw and a state funeral given. Um, in many ways, closing that wartime chapter in Poland's history. That's it for us. That's our family stories. Those are our memories of Saranac Lake. But Saranac Lake represents something else for the larger Philippine story. It's a story of succession. It's a story of institutions. It's a story of a country being exactly that. It was the first time where um, leadership in the Philippines passed from one leader to another without the need for a coup, without the need for revolt, but simply due to the standard operation of law. Um, Carlos P. Romulo, in his lifetime, perhaps the most famous Filipino, someone well known to all the wartime generation, was the secretary of propaganda, basically of information in my grandfather's government. And in his memoirs, he recounted that 2 days before Quezon's death, he received permission from Quezon to join MacArthur in Australia and received instructions on statements to be made about announcements for the future of the Philippines. But that on August 1st, he had received a call from General Valdez, the general whose picture I showed you earlier, telling him that the president had died, and that it became Romulo's turn to inform the vice president, Sergio Osmeña, that he was now president. Again, a remarkable, when you think of it, for countries like the Philippines, then and now, who in many ways had to adopt Western ways and institutions that were perhaps not as organic for them as let's say it is for you, that this was in and of itself a remarkable thing. One made possible by something Filipinos take for granted to this day. In 1935, when we were writing our constitution for independence, the question arose of whether we should even have a vice president. Because as John Nance Garner himself said of your vice presidency, it isn't worth a pitcher of warm spit, but it has to happen. And the decision made by the Filipinos then was that you had to have a vice president because everyone felt that the one who would become the first elected president of the Philippines was Manuel Quezon, but by then he had tuberculosis, and everyone felt he could die at any time, and therefore a designated successor was necessary. But would Filipinos, unused to this institution, accept a successor? And so Filipinos have to this day an unusual system where we elect our vice presidents separately from the president on the very simple premise that even if you succeed to the presidency, you have to have your own mandate. So that makes us unique, and it stems from a very human condition way back in the 1930s. One that it turns out um, was of exceptional foresight because of our first three elected presidents, Quezon, Osmeña, Manuel Rojas, two of them died in office. And therefore, that provision of having a vice president and one with his own mandate became much more necessary than people could have imagined at that time. So let me wrap up um, with just a few thoughts on the man and his times, and perhaps an interesting story for one of you in the audience. Here's a picture of St. Matthew's Cathedral, August 3, 1944, the moment that Quezon's coffin is being carried out of St. Matthew's Cathedral, where JFK's funeral mass also took place, on the way to the official funeral in Washington, D.C. There are people there standing in the middle of a blazingly hot Washington summer, but you'll see three Filipinos there, and I'm going to show you an inset of them. Those three Filipinos are three Filipino writers. Um, One of them, the very grim, tall man in the center of those three figures, was a man named Jose Garcia Villa, one of our most famous poets. Um, Jose Garcia Villa's father had been the medical aide de camp of President Emilio Aguinaldo. Jose Garcia Villa, in turn, together with Bienvenido Santos, the balding fellow in this picture, and P.C. Morante, another writer, ended up being given jobs in the Philippine government in exile, sort of as public works as assistants, because what else are out of luck writers going to do except find refuge in their government during the war? But this is a 6 degrees of separation picture because Jose Garcia Villa was the literary mentor and friend of Luis Francia, who is the other Filipino here with us tonight. So this is a story that is as much about 6 degrees of separation, not only for our family and those of you who live in Saranac Lake, but Filipinos all over the Philippines and the world who have connections to many faces who would be familiar in the pictures I've just shown you, and names that may be only um, people that you encounter in the history books, but are all tied to us one way or another. These are ties that can exist all through your lives. Going through our family's papers, I found a letter of congratulations from Dr. Hayes, um, the doctor who took care of Quezon and Saranac Lake, congratulating my grandmother and her family for news that the Philippines had been liberated. Ties that therefore continued. And then I found a letter from my grandmother a couple of years later saying, a Filipino doctor is going to visit you, Dr. Hayes, because his name is Miguel Cañizares. He is the head of a place called the Quezon Institute, which takes place of tuberculosis patients. And the time has come for Filipinos to learn from Americans like you how to take care of patients like my husband. So it just continues. I heard a touching story from Ivan Henares that he had encountered an elderly gentleman in Saranac Lake who had been a 7 or 8 year old boy in 1944, whose father happened to be the only undertaker in town, who had been brought to Camp McMartin to stand all afternoon in that walk-in refrigerator embalming President Quezon, and who thereafter, for decade after decade, would be asked to go back to Camp McMartin because little trickles of Filipinos would show up unannounced in Saranac Lake on a very quiet pilgrimage to see where Quezon had died. For decade after decade, can you imagine? Until this gentleman said the 1980s when they stopped coming. Because of course by then the wartime generation had started to go. But I like to think that for people like him, for people like Luis Francia, who will have an encounter with people who were part of that whole scene, for you and me, for my cousin who's watching here with me now, um, the era of those who were alive then has gone. We are now in an era where those of us who had the good fortune of knowing that generation are now entrusted with the task of passing on their stories to you. We've done that today. Um, and we hope that you will do your part and continue those stories in the future. For my part, as a writer, it's hard to recapture what other writers like Carlos Bulosan, who every Filipino American encounters because he wrote eloquently of that period. Nick Joaquin, another Filipino writer, says that there's a very touching scene in which Bulosan visited Quezon in Washington, and the scene touched him very deeply. But how do you recapture that? I think it's impossible for people who weren't there. Um, an American scholar summed up Quezon in a way that I have always appreciated. He said that he was a living bridge between a country and a society that was encountering modernity and its challenges and needed someone to shepherd them through the process. I think that is perhaps the best way to understand Quezon as a man who looked forward and not backwards. He himself had a very clear idea of what power and responsibility both meant. It is something that remains as a challenge for every generation that tries to understand what is this democracy business and what business is it of us Filipinos. He felt that, whether you like it or not, Filipinos cared more for good government than self-government, a puzzling reality for a democracy. That the challenge for any Filipino leader was to resist the temptation to exceed your powers and the fear of the governed that their leaders might abuse their powers by improprieties. And that fundamentally the expectation of every Filipino for every leader who claims to lead them is that that leader should be able to maintain order. To my mind, this is the best articulation, for better or worse, of the relationship Filipinos have with their leaders and how it ends up positively or negatively for those leaders. Carlos P. Romulo, the man I introduced to you a while earlier, put it even more simply and said, because we are a country and a people who wants to have leaders who make decisions for us, again, for better or worse. My grandfather once told a Filipino historian, talking about a member of his government, that I hired him as a man, but he served me like a dog, which to me is something I have shared with my own staff when I was in government and with many Filipinos when I give talks to them about their government, which is we may have many views about what we like and dislike about those who have tasked with leading us, but we must never forget that it takes two to tango, which was Quezon's favorite dance. That power exercised by others is also something that you and I have the power to accept or reject. It will be up to us whether we will be men or women standing tall or bootlickers and dogs to those who are more powerful than us. This was an insight he had about human nature, and one that I feel is rare among people who have and hold power. The Philippines Free Press ended with an editorial in 1953, and this is my parting words for you. It said that, to his credit, Quezon may have played politics ruthlessly and even recklessly, but he had virtues that his successors have failed to have. That he could go far, but those who came after him would go too far because he had a private conscience which drew the line beyond which it would be dishonorable for a public official to go. The Philippines Free Press, as far back as 1953, said that this is actually a line which is well and good if you have it in yourself, but it is a line which only the law should draw. That is why we have the rule of law. Now, if Quezon did not overstep that line because he had a conscience, the reality is that his heirs had none of that conscience. And the sad thing is that the law may be too weak to draw it for them. A criticism then that I think is a criticism that endures to this day for Filipinos and for any society that still lives in a democracy. So that's my show and tell for you today. Thank you for your indulgence and for letting me share these things with you.